I knew from even before I was born. And when I was born, I was named after a character in a novel titled Ingqumbo Yeminyanya, the wrath of the ancestors. The main character is Zanemvula. So I was named after that character, which means that whoever controls life out there knew that I was going to be a storyteller. I tell a story. I just see myself as a storyteller. People who read my books and so on, they see them as spiritual. When I wrote them, I didn't see them as spiritual. I was just telling the story using that mode. Some people call it magical realism and so on. But who am I? It's not for me to say. It's for the reader or the one who's listening to me, the one who's looking at my paintings, to decide whether, there is any divinity in them. What I say is irrelevant. The art must talk for itself. I knew also as I was growing up that I wanted to tell stories. I grew up here in Orlando East. During holidays in December, we went emakhaya. In my case, it would be where my father came from, in the Eastern Cape. And there, of course, we would tell stories, classical African stories, passed from one generation to another, stories that were passed as they were, from one generation to the next. But then there would be a time when my grandmother, who was the chief storyteller in that environment, would say, "Ngoku lixesha lokuqweba ibali," which means now is the time to improvise a story. That meant that now, instead of telling the classical tale that we learnt from those who came before us, we now had to compose our own stories. At the beginning, we would take the classical stories, Intsomi, Inganekwane, Tsumu, Salungana. We would take those and then add our own elements to them. But the better we became, we were able now to compose the whole story on your own. That comes from your imagination. You see, during that time when the grandmother says, "Lixesha lokuqweba ibali," now is the time to compose your own story. So during those moments then, that's when one learned to be a storyteller. But of course, you can't be a storyteller without being a reader yourself. So Dobsonville, Orlando East, I'll be reading stories. I'll be reading comic books, for instance. In other words, stories from the Western world and so on. But come December, I'm in the Eastern Cape. I'm listening to indigenous stories that have been passed from one generation to the next. So during all that time, of course, I may not consciously have known that I'm being trained as a storyteller, but actually I was. And when the time came, because I would draw as well a lot during that time, I started drawing when, in the compound where my father had his orchard, not my father, my grandfather, fruit trees and so on and so forth, on that mountain, just on the borders of Lesotho and the Eastern Cape. There were caves, that were called the Bushman caves. There were paintings of Abattoir people, You call them the San today, the San people. The white people call them Bushmen. We call them Abatwa. So there were paintings in these caves, and then we would paint our own with chalk that we stole at school. Would paint on these paintings, Abatwa, which was not a good thing to do, but we didn't know any better, we were kids. Would trace those drawings of Abatwa and so on, and then trace them in our exercise books as well, which means that I was taught by the ancient Abatwa, who lived generations ago and left us the wealth of those paintings in the caves. It all begins on that mountain called Yahom Mountain, on the borders of Lesotho and the Eastern Cape, which is where the storytelling of Inganekwane Intsomi Tsomo, that's how then one learned to draw.